2 signatures. That is all it took. 2 doctors' names on a piece of paper, and a woman who had woken up that morning in her own bed, in her own house, wearing her own clothes, thinking her own thoughts, could be removed from her life and placed inside an institution from which she had no legal mechanism to release herself, no right of appeal, no guaranteed access to a lawyer, and no assurance that anyone outside the walls would be told where she was or what was being done to her. 2 signatures. The Lunacy Act of 1845 required them. 2 medical certificates signed by 2 qualified doctors, certifying that the person named in the document was of unsound mind and in need of confinement. The doctors did not need to be specialists in mental illness. They did not need to have examined the patient for any specified length of time. They did not need to agree on a diagnosis. They needed only to sign. And in the case of a married woman whose husband had arranged the examination, the doctors who signed were frequently doctors the husband already knew, doctors he had selected, doctors whose fee he was paying, and doctors who arrived at the house already in possession of the husband's account of his wife's behavior, which they then confirmed with an examination that lasted, in many documented cases, less than 30 minutes. A woman could be declared insane for arguing with her husband, for refusing to obey his instructions, for expressing unhappiness with her marriage, for reading too many novels, for grief that lasted longer than her family considered appropriate, for speaking too freely about subjects the culture had designated as unsuitable for female discussion, for what the medical establishment called hysteria, a diagnosis so broad that it could accommodate virtually any form of female behavior that deviated from the standard of docile, cheerful, uncomplaining domestic compliance that Victorian society had defined as normal and that Victorian medicine had defined as sane. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this system operated, who it consumed, what happened inside the walls it placed them behind, and why the women who entered Victorian asylums on the strength of 2 signatures sometimes remained there for decades, not because they were ill, but because the system that had confined them had no mechanism for admitting it had made a mistake. This is Dreadful History Files, and the history of women and madness in Victorian England is a history of diagnosis as punishment, treatment as control, and silence as the only symptom the system reliably produced. The list of reasons for which a woman could be committed to a Victorian asylum has been preserved in the admission registers of institutions across England, and reading it produces a specific kind of horror that intensifies with every entry. Because the entries are not descriptions of illness. They are descriptions of life, domestic unhappiness, religious excitement, disappointment in love, excessive reading, overwork, grief, jealousy, bad temper, intemperance, novel reading, political excitement, suppressed menstruation, change of life, fright, trouble, imaginary female trouble. These are not diagnoses. They are the ordinary contents of a human life reframed as pathology by a medical system that had decided, with considerable institutional confidence, that any female experience intense enough to be visible was an experience intense enough to be treated, and that treatment, in the vocabulary of Victorian psychiatry, meant confinement. The admission records of Colney Hatch Asylum, which opened in 1851 as the largest asylum in Europe and was originally built to house 1,000 patients, document that by the 1860s, the second most common reason for a woman to be admitted was the death of a child, not a psychotic break following the death of a child, not a documented inability to function following the death of a child. The death of a child, listed as the cause of the madness, as though grief itself were the disease, rather than a response to a loss, that the Victorian child mortality rate made devastatingly common. Women in that asylum had frequently been particularly affected by the loss of a child or children, but the attending physicians often failed to recognize their sorrow as a primary cause of their depression, and instead recorded it as evidence of an unsound mind requiring institutional management. The medical framework that produced these admissions was not a fringe position held by a handful of eccentric practitioners. It was the mainstream consensus of Victorian psychiatry, endorsed by the most prominent physicians of the era, and reinforced by a legal system that gave husbands the authority to initiate the process and gave the medical profession the authority to complete it. William Acton's position that respectable women felt no sexual desire was mirrored by a broader psychiatric assumption that respectable women experienced emotional life within a narrow band of acceptable intensity, and that any emotional experience outside that band, whether it was anger, grief, desire, ambition, frustration, or despair, constituted evidence of a mind operating beyond its designed capacity. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now, because the next part of this story is the part that the asylum walls were specifically built to hide, and it has been waiting behind them for over a century. The examination was the point at which the system's design became most visible, because the examination was where the pretense of medical rigor was thinnest, and the reality of domestic power was most exposed. A husband who wished to have his wife committed contacted a doctor, usually the family physician, and described his wife's behavior. The doctor arrived at the house, examined the wife, and signed the first certificate. A second doctor was then brought in to provide the second signature. The 1828 legislation had specified that the two doctors could not have any association with the asylum to which the patient would be sent, a provision designed to prevent collusion between the certifying physicians and the proprietors of private madhouses. The provision did not prevent the husband from selecting the doctors, paying their fees, or briefing them in advance on the symptoms he expected them to find. Rosina Bulwer-Lytton understood this mechanism with the clarity of a woman who had been on the receiving end of it. In June 1858, Rosina, who was the estranged wife of the novelist and politician Edward Bulwer-Lytton, appeared at the hustings during her husband's by-election campaign and publicly denounced him for his treatment of her. Edward responded by having her committed to a private asylum. The doctors who certified her had connections to her husband. The examination was brief, the certification was signed, and Rosina, a published author, a woman of intelligence and articulacy, a woman whose only demonstrable symptoms were anger at a husband who had separated her from her children, and fury at a legal system that had given him the power to do so, was removed from public life and placed inside an institution. She was released after 3 weeks, but only because her celebrity and the public outcry that followed her confinement generated enough pressure to make her continued detention politically untenable for her husband. In 1880, she published A Blighted Life, her account of the experience, in which she wrote a sentence that sits in the historical record with the weight of a verdict delivered by the accused against the court. Never was a more criminal or despotic law passed, Rosina wrote, than that which now enables a husband to lock up his wife in a madhouse on the certificate of two medical men, who often in haste, frequently for a bribe, certify to madness where none exists. Rosina was famous. Rosina had friends with access to the press. Rosina had the resources and the platform to fight back. The women who did not have those things, the women whose confinement did not produce newspaper headlines and parliamentary questions, the women who were committed quietly from houses where nobody outside the family knew what had happened, disappeared into the asylum system without the public ever learning their names. They are the majority of this story. They are also the part of this story that the archive preserves most poorly, because the archive was maintained by the institution that confined them, and the institution had no incentive to record anything that might call its own judgment into question. Louisa Nottage was committed by her male relatives in the 1840s to prevent her from giving her inheritance to a revivalist clergyman's community. Her case became a public scandal and inspired Wilkie Collins to write The Woman in White, the 1859 novel that crystallized the Victorian public's fear that sane individuals were being imprisoned in lunatic asylums. Georgina Weldon, a singer and spiritualist, successfully sued her husband in 1884 for attempted wrongful confinement and became one of the most prominent advocates for lunacy law reform in the latter part of the century. These women fought the system and won. Their victories were individual. The system continued. What happened after the signatures were obtained is the part of this story that the two doctors who signed the certificates never saw, because the certificates were their final involvement. They signed, they were paid, and they left. The woman they had certified was transported to the asylum, sometimes in a private carriage, sometimes in a vehicle specifically designed for the purpose, and in some documented cases physically restrained during the journey if she resisted. She arrived at the door of an institution she had not chosen, carrying nothing she had not been permitted to bring, and was admitted into a process that stripped from her, with the same methodical thoroughness the workhouse applied to its inmates, every remaining marker of the person she had been before the signatures were obtained. Her clothes were taken. She was issued a uniform. Her hair was examined. Her body was inspected. She was assigned a ward, which was determined by the severity of her condition as assessed by the asylum's medical officer, who based his assessment on the certificates that had accompanied her, on the account provided by whoever had arranged her admission, and on his own examination, which was conducted in circumstances that the modern discipline of psychiatry would recognize as almost perfectly designed to produce the symptoms it was looking for. She was frightened. She was disoriented. She was angry. She was in a strange building surrounded by strangers, wearing uniforms, having been removed from her home by force, and every emotional response she produced in these circumstances, the fear, the confusion, the rage, the tears, was recorded as further evidence of the condition the certificates had already diagnosed. The treatments awaiting her inside the asylum operated under a philosophy that the Victorian medical establishment called moral treatment, a term that contained its own irony in a concentration sufficient to survive a century and a half. Moral treatment, as originally conceived by reformers like the Quaker William Tuke at the York Retreat in 1796, had been a genuine attempt to replace the chains and cages of earlier madhouses with a regime of routine, dignity, and humane care. By the time the philosophy had been absorbed into the overcrowded, underfunded county asylums of the mid-19th century, what remained of it was the language of reform applied to practices that bore diminishing resemblance to what the language described. Hydrotherapy was the treatment most consistently documented across the Victorian asylum system, and it was the treatment that most efficiently revealed the gap between the medical justification and the physical reality. Cold baths, administered in sessions of 15 to 20 minutes, were prescribed for patients in states of agitation or mania. The patient was immersed in cold water, sometimes restrained, sometimes held in place by attendants, and kept in the bath until the physician determined that the desired calming effect had been achieved. In cases where the patient did not respond to a single session, the treatment was repeated. In some documented cases, it was repeated daily. In some documented cases, it was continued for hours. The shower bath was a variant that involved restraining the patient in a specially designed chair and directing jets of cold water at her face and body. The stated purpose was to reduce excitement. The physical experience was indistinguishable from assault. Patients were sometimes immersed in ponds using a chair device that lowered them into the water until they were at the point of unconsciousness before they were raised and allowed to recover, and the process could be repeated until the physician was satisfied. The word satisfied in this context meant that the patient had stopped resisting, which was interpreted as evidence that the treatment had worked, rather than evidence that the patient had been subdued by the physical trauma of near drowning into a state of exhausted compliance that the physician's notes recorded as improvement. Force feeding was administered to patients who refused to eat. The refusal was recorded as a symptom. The possibility that the refusal was a rational response by a sane person who did not wish to be in the institution and was using the only form of resistance available to her was not a possibility the system had been designed to consider. A feeding tube was inserted through the nose or mouth, and liquid nourishment was introduced directly into the stomach. The procedure was painful. It was frightening. It was performed by attendants who were frequently undertrained and who managed wards of patients whose numbers had long since exceeded the institution's capacity to provide individualized care. The patient who refused food and was force-fed learned what every patient in the asylum eventually learned, which was that resistance was itself a symptom, and that the treatment for resistance was more treatment. Physical restraints were used on patients classified as violent or unmanageable. Straitjackets confined the arms. Leather cuffs secured the wrists and ankles. Crib beds, which were beds with wooden or metal bars enclosing the sleeping space, confined patients who were considered a danger to themselves. The restraints could be applied for hours. In some documented cases, they were applied for days. The stated purpose was always the patient's safety. The experienced reality was always the elimination of the patient's ability to move, to speak, to resist, to express in any physical form the distress that the institution had classified as illness and was treating with the tools of confinement. Most of what you have just heard was documented in the asylum's own records, maintained by the institutions themselves and stored in archives where they remained largely unexamined for over a century. If you believe the women who were confined behind these walls deserve to have their stories told with the honesty the system denied them, drop a comment below. Your engagement is what keeps dreadful history files reaching the people who need to hear what happened. The years inside were the part of the story that the admission records documented, and the discharge records frequently did not, because the discharge records for many patients do not exist. Not because they were lost, but because the patients were never discharged. A woman admitted to a Victorian county asylum could remain there for the rest of her natural life. The admission was permanent until someone with authority determined otherwise, and the people with authority were the asylum's medical officers, who had every professional incentive to maintain their diagnosis and no professional incentive to revisit it. A patient who was reclassified as sane represented an implicit acknowledgement that the original certification had been wrong, and the system that had produced the certification was not designed to accommodate that acknowledgement. Colney Hatch, which had been built for 1,000 patients, was housing over 2,000 by the late 1850s after extensions were added. The staff could not cope with the influx. Mechanical restraints, which the institution had originally been designed to eliminate, were reintroduced because the attendants could not manage the wards without them. Patients who had been admitted with conditions that might have responded to what modern psychiatry would recognize as therapeutic intervention, instead received custodial care, which meant they were housed, fed, clothed, and kept alive inside an institution that had neither the resources nor the philosophical framework to help them recover. The asylum had become what its critics had always feared it would become: a warehouse for people the outside world did not want to deal with, maintained at public expense, inspected at intervals by commissioners whose reports documented overcrowding and understaffing with a regularity that suggests the documentation was the system's response to the problem rather than a precursor to solving it. The women who lived inside these institutions for years and decades occupied a specific category of existence that the historical record preserves in fragments. They wore the asylum's clothes. They ate the asylum's food. They performed the asylum's work, which for women meant domestic labor, cleaning, laundry, sewing, the same tasks they had performed in the homes they had been removed from, performed now inside an institution that justified the work as therapeutic and compensated it with nothing. They slept in dormitories. They exercised in walled yards. They attended chapel. They existed within a routine so total and so invariable that the years inside it became indistinguishable from each other, measured not by events, but by the absence of events, by the repetition of identical days stretching forward without interruption toward a discharge that might come in months or might never come at all. The women who fought the system from inside it left records that survive because fighting the system produced documentation, petitions to the commissioners in lunacy, letters to family members that were sometimes forwarded and sometimes intercepted, testimony in court cases brought by relatives or advocates who had managed to locate the patient and challenge the certification. These records represent the visible fraction of a population that was largely invisible, and they represent it imperfectly because the women who generated them were by definition the women with the resources, the literacy, and the external connections to make their voices heard. The women without those resources, the working-class women committed through the pauper lunacy system on a single doctor's certificate and a magistrate's order, left almost no record of their own experience. They appear in the admission registers as a name, an age, a parish, a diagnosis, and a date. The discharge column beside their entry is sometimes filled and sometimes blank, and the blank is the record. The blank means they did not leave. The law changed. It changed slowly, unevenly, and considerably later than the conditions it was responding to required. The 1890 Lunacy Act introduced judicial oversight of private commitments, requiring a magistrate's order before a person could be confined. It did not change the system for pauper patients, who continued to be committed under the 1845 Act, which meant that the women with the least resources continued to receive the least protection. The 1959 Mental Health Act replaced the lunacy legislation entirely, introducing voluntary admission and establishing the framework within which modern mental health law operates. The journey from 2 signatures on a piece of paper to a legal system that recognizes the patient's right to consent, to refuse treatment, and to challenge confinement took over a century, and it took that long not because the problems were invisible, but because the people experiencing them were women, and the system that confined them was administered by men, and the distance between those two facts was measured in decades of reform that arrived too late for the women who needed it most. She was not ill. That possibility needs to be stated plainly, because the historical record requires it. Not every woman committed to a Victorian asylum was sane. Mental illness existed. It caused genuine suffering. It required genuine care. Some of the women inside those institutions were experiencing conditions that modern psychiatry would recognize, diagnose, and treat with tools that the Victorian medical establishment simply did not possess. Those women deserved better treatment than they received, and the failure to provide it is its own category of historical wrong that this video does not minimize. But alongside those women, in the same wards, wearing the same uniforms, eating the same food, receiving the same treatments, were women whose only illness was inconvenience. Women whose grief lasted too long. Women whose anger was too visible. Women whose independence was too threatening. Women whose husbands wanted them gone, and whose doctors were willing to sign the paper that made it possible. Those women were not patients. They were prisoners, confined by a medical system that had given itself the authority to define the boundaries of acceptable female experience, and the power to institutionalize anyone who crossed them. The asylum walls still stand. Some of the buildings are apartments now, some are offices. Some are heritage sites with informational plaques. The wards where women were restrained and bathed in cold water and force-fed through tubes and confined for years on the strength of 2 signatures are rooms with different furniture now, occupied by people who do not know what happened in them and have no reason to ask. The women who lived in those rooms left almost nothing behind except the admission registers that recorded their entry, and the blank spaces in the discharge columns that recorded their absence, and the silence that the asylum was specifically designed to produce, which it produced with a reliability that the system would have called a successful outcome, and that the women inside it would have called something else entirely, if anyone had thought to ask them, which for most of them, nobody ever did. They deserved to be asked. They deserved to be heard. They deserved a system that treated their distress as evidence that something was wrong with their circumstances, rather than evidence that something was wrong with their minds. And the fact that it took a century for any of those things to happen is not a reflection of how difficult the problem was. It is a reflection of how little the people with the power to solve it cared about the people it was happening to. 2 signatures. That is all it took to erase a life. The signatures took less than a minute. The erasure lasted decades. And the women who lived inside that gap between the minute and the decades deserved better than the silence the system gave them. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was, and the next story is already waiting behind a door that someone decided you were never meant to open.